Hi everyone, my name is Steph, this is the Novelty Corner and welcome back to my channel. Today I have a Books Beside My Bed video for you where I wrap up the last 7 days worth of reading. Full confession, one of my box lights has decided to fall apart, quite literally. It no longer wants to stay upright. So the lighting situation is not great because it happened to happen on the one day this month where it has been overcast in the morning. So lighting is not on point, but we will muddle through this regardless. This has been a very fascinating week for me. I've read a lot, but I've also not read a lot because I got horrifically sick on Monday and it was also the last week of school, and so trying to recover from that, working and then coming home at night, I had absolutely no capacity to do anything at the end of the day. The majority of this reading happened on the weekend and Thursday, Friday. Actually, not even Friday because I went out. I hate this time of year. I really do. I'm on holidays now, which means reading, well, maybe not for the next week because Christmas is nuts, but I have plans for lots and lots of reading for the foreseeable future. All right, so we're going to jump straight into the books because otherwise we're going to be here for ages. The first book that I read this week was Content Warning Everything by Akwaeke Emezi, which is a poetry collection of theirs that I had borrowed as an audiobook from Luly. This collection is really fascinating and it looks at religion and queerness and family estrangement, but also family connection. It does have content warnings for rape and SA, so just be aware of that when you go into it. But it is the first time that I've read any of Akwaeke Emezi's poetry, and I loved You Made a Fool of Death with her beauty. And I'm trying to read a little bit more of their backlist, so it was really nice to dive into this, especially as an audiobook. Like it came across really well as a listening experience. Interestingly enough, this book, which was not on my TBR for the Queer Lit Readathon, which it's also, this is the wrap up for the Queer Lit Readathon, it fits within that as well. So I was very, very happy that I got to listen to it. The rest of these books are all queer titles as well. I wasn't following the bingo board or anything, and it was probably a good thing that I wasn't because I would have been really upset with myself with the fact that I just couldn't get as much done this week. But I did read In the Middle of Somewhere by Roan and Parrish, which is the Middle of Somewhere book 1. This was a book that I started in a try chapter video and had been told that it was a really good book. And it was. I think the only reason that I didn't love it, I think the way that some other people did, is because this relationship has a lot of back and forth. So this is an romance. It is set in a small town and it's two characters who meet haphazardly one night. You have Daniel, who is an English professor or literature professor or something like that, and he is applying for a job in a small town. He comes from a family that is very deeply homophobic and have never seen him for who he is and don't believe that what he is doing is going to make a career. And so he's gone to this small town to try and get this job. After his job interview, he ends up running his car off the road while trying to avoid hitting a dog. He does clip the dog. The dog is fine. The dog is a big part of the story. And he's helped out by a guy called Rex who lives sort of in an isolated cabin close by. Anyway, there's an attraction between the two of them, but nothing ever happens of it. And then months later, when Daniel gets this job and actually moves to the town, he eventually runs back into Rex. And it's the two of them building this relationship, but the relationship is very complicated because both men have very complicated feelings about relationships. And Daniel is dealing with a lot in terms of just processing how he wants to be seen in a relationship in town. But it was a really interesting book and I did really enjoy it. But it is on the longer side of a romance. It is over 400 pages long, and so there is a lot of that back and forth and miscommunication and all that sort of stuff happening throughout the book where they're trying to figure out, you know, their balance in the relationship. And I don't mind that, but maybe this weekend I just wasn't in the mood where that actually became an ultimate favorite, but it definitely became a book that I really enjoyed and a series that I really want to continue. I do want to say it does have chronic migraine representation as well as dyslexia representation in here. You do have content warnings. Hang on, I have to read them all. So there's homophobia I mentioned earlier, death of a parent, there's a hate crime, there's emotional abuse. There is mentions of an essay attempt from a side character who is then the main character in the next book, I believe, and also mentions of a character dying from cancer, historically off page. Like I said, really interesting book, really interested in continuing the series. I also wanted to prioritize North is the Night by Emily Rath, which came out this week as well. Well, at least in the US. It comes out here in January. And this is her fantasy book, and it will get dubbed by people as a romantasy book, but it is definitely more a fantasy with a romantic subplot as opposed to fantasy romance. I mean, maybe people will disagree with me, but I think it definitely leans more into the fantasy. And it's a book that is based around Finnish mythology, which is really, really cool. So our two main characters are Siri and Aina, and they are two best friends. And this, like, the sapphic undertones in the story is between the two of them. The undertone is there the entire book, but the actual relationship, people will probably get a little bit upset if they think that the sapphic relationship in this first book, because it's a duology, is explicit on page. The commitment to the relationship comes at the end of the book, and the undertone is through the whole book, but actually the primary romantic relationship in this story is not them. It's actually an MF relationship, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the two of them are best friends, and they are living in their small community. And at the very start of the book, we find out that the Swedes have been coming into Finnish land, taking over and bringing their god, the Christian god. Siri in particular is very unhappy with this. And they also have heard stories that the old gods or monsters are taking women from Finnish villages. And when this old god comes to take Siri, Aina ends up stepping in and being taken in her place. And of the two, Aina is much more meek and mild. She's not the stand up and fight type. And so Siri is determined to get her back and ends up setting out on a quest to find essentially a sorcerer of Finnish legend to get him to help her cross over into the underworld where she believes that Aina has been taken. Part of the story is told from Siri's perspective as she's on this quest, and then you also have Aina's perspective where she is taken, and we find out she's been taken by the witches currently ruling the underworld. The Witch Queen has exiled the king of the underworld, and so Aina sets about trying to free him, and along the way has to commit to a marriage with him. So if you're thinking it sounds very Hades and Persephone, it does sound very Hades and Persephone, but it is the Finnish version of it, and it is so fascinating. I really loved learning about the Finnish mythology. I actually want to listen to the audio of this before I talk about it again, because I want to get the pronunciation of all the names and everything right, and at the moment I just I'm conceptually still trying to figure out how everything sounds in my head. The two stories intersect when Siri finally makes her way, obviously, to rescue Aina, and the whole thing is really complex, and you would expect that you would be really unhappy with one relationship, but you kind of understand why it came about. And so it's fascinating. By the time you get to the end, I had very conflicted feelings about how everything played out. Not in a bad way, just in a way that I'm like, you want everyone to be happy, but not everyone is going to get their happy story. And being a duet, obviously, there's a lot of things that are left open to continue, including this sort of side story about the daughter of one of the goddesses that Aina meets in the underworld as well. And that, you know, that's going to come into play in the second book. My favorite thing in this entire book, and that's just because it's a me thing and I think it's hilarious, is that there is an actual bear versus man scene in this book. Bless you, Emily Rath. I don't know if that's part of Finnish mythology, but it definitely played into contemporary cultural sort of stuff, and I deeply loved that scene. Also want to content that there is mentions of SA in the book, as well as a surprise pregnancy, so just be aware of that if you're going into the story. I really enjoyed it. All right, then I read Unhallowed by Jordan L. Hawke, which is the Rath and Roan book 1. Again, this was another book I read for a tri-chapter video. This is an historical paranormal romance. We are following Sebastian and Vespa. Sebastian is a librarian who lives in a small town, and the library he works at is charged with, you know, storing and keeping safe many books, including some very dangerous magical tomes. I think I said in the tri-chapter video, this book has the best opening line in that it's something about a monster being on a train. And we find out that Vespa is a bookbinder who is traveling to this small town to take up a placement at this library. He's an outsider, which straight away sets him apart from everyone else. Sebastian is very reluctant for him to be there, especially since he's replacing the previous bookbinder who has gone missing, and that was Sebastian's friend. And Sebastian is trying to figure out what happened to him. And anyway, Vespa comes in. He is the outsider. We also know that Vespa refers to himself as a monster. We know that he believes himself different. He grew up in a cult. We know that he was supposed to help bring about the end of days, and he didn't do that. And so he's been cast out, and he's trying to protect his brother, who is also a monster. But we don't know how or why they're monsters. And I kind of want to tell you because it's one of my favorite things, but it would be a giant spoiler for the story. Anyway, eventually Sebastian and Vespa are able to connect and to overcome sort of the animosity that Sebastian initially has towards Vespa coming in and taking his friend's place. They end up working together when they uncover a plot that is happening in the library. Now, initially, Vespa is also there for a purpose. He's there to map the library for somebody else who wants to come in and steal something. And that does eventually come out and is a source of conflict for the story. But for the most part, they are committed to finding Sebastian's friend and then uncovering sort of this mystery and history of the library. It was really fun, and the plot was tied in with Halley's Comet passing overhead and magical things and all the monsters. And when you find out who Vesper is, like, Vesper is the most precious of souls and just needs a hug and people to tell him that they love him. And that's what he gets in the story. Also, Sebastian's family is fantastic. He lives with his sister and his sister's children. We meet one of his sister's husbands, and it turns out she has many husbands because they're all sailors. They are all traveling, and most of the time they spend like 2 years away at sea. And so she has multiple kids from multiple men, from multiple marriages. They are all a family. Nobody in this particular story blinks an eye. She does mention that she's faced some comments from people who don't agree with the way that she lives her life. But the whole family dynamic was amazing. And when they find out who and what Vesper is, the kids' reactions are great. And she just goes to bat for him as well. And I love that so much. All right. And then the last book that I read this week was a sapphic story by an Australian author, and that is Not Just Gal Pals by Elizabeth Luly. And this was utterly delightful, and I cannot wait to get my hands on. There's another book that she's written that is a sapphic romance, and I really want to get my hands on it. So this is a sapphic small town romantic comedy kind of story. So it's a contemporary romance. It is about Jenny and Blake. Jenny is an influencer who has run afoul of people and is threatened to be cancelled. And her agent basically says, you've got a wedding in your hometown, go lay low for a couple of months. I'll work on things in the background and we'll get you back to where you were. Just, don't forget to keep posting. And you're in a small town, so maybe do it with some plaid and, do some fun family-friendly things. And so she's going back to this small town, and while she's there, she ends up having to work with Blake, who is the local doctor. They went to high school together. They were not really friends, and Jenny believes that Blake doesn't like her because she's an influencer. And Blake is a doctor, so she thinks there's this perception thing. But the reality is Blake has kind of had a crush on Jenny for years and years, ever since high school. And whenever she's around her, she just can't communicate effectively. And so she's very gruff and very blunt and often says the wrong thing. But throughout the book, we find out that Blake is actually a very, very warm, very kind person who, big thing in the book is that she's constantly looking after her niece and nephew. And Jenny ends up tagging along on some of these outings, and the two connect as they're helping Amanda to prepare for the wedding. There's a few wedding mishaps and things along the day that Jenny and Blake have to work together to solve because they're both bridesmaids within the wedding. And it kind of forces them together and to confront their preconceived notions of one another. And it was just great. In this one, kind of the source of conflict is that Jenny is always planning on moving back to LA and not sticking around in the small town. And so it is kind of an external conflict. There are a few little internal relationship conflicts as well going on, but the biggest one is that there's a timeline on Jenny sticking around in town. But I was really pleasantly surprised by this one, and I had such a great time. The writing style is great. I'm really glad that I picked this up at a book signing last year, and I cannot wait to get the next one. She's going to be at a book signing later in 2025, I think. So I will probably be collecting the book then. And that is everything that I have read this week. I don't know how next week's wrap up is going to go. Next week's wrap up is going to be my last one. This is my penultimate weekly wrap up for the time being. So hopefully I get some good reading in between now and Christmas. So fingers crossed. In the comments, I'd love to know, have you read any of these books, or are you planning on picking any of them up, or do you have other recommendations for books that are similar? If you want to let me know that you're here but you don't leave a comment, feel free to leave a star emoji. Otherwise, I hope that wherever you're in the world, you're staying safe and healthy, and I will see you in my next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye everyone.